I'm Janet Silver. A new speaker, a new premier, both a note for the history books. Plus a couple of interesting meetings next week while Parliament is on a break following the Thanksgiving weekend. To break this all down, I'm joined by two of my colleagues here at Syntax Strategic, Lindsay Campbell and John Dugal. And John, I'm going to start with you because on Wednesday, full disclosure, we're recording this on Thursday, the new Speaker of the House, Greg Fergus, was in the Speaker's chair for question period. Well, first, history was made with his election, but interesting, he even stood at one point and told the Prime Minister that just before the Prime Minister was about to answer a question that he had 17 seconds on the clock. And he also spoke about the decorum in the House and that before the House returned after its Thanksgiving break, Fergus went on to say that there would be reflective guidelines that the speakers would be using for debate in the House of Commons. So, John, I just want to start off by getting your thoughts on Greg Fergus as the new speaker and how he may change or guide question period.
Yeah, maybe I'll start off with just a temperature check of the House over the past couple of weeks, because I mean, obviously we've seen the conundrums, we've seen the franticness of not debate, but just tomfoolery, let's say partisanship around all sides of the House of Commons over the last couple of weeks, following the unfortunate events that happened with Speaker Rhoda that led to his ultimate demise and him stepping away. And so far, you do get the sense that Greg Fergus coming in as the duly elected speaker, who, again, he's elected by all of his peers. He has to receive a majority of the House support in order to take that chair. And so far, him coming in has actually cooled the temperature down. It's really done a good job of actually bringing things back into reality. Parliamentarians are now focused back on real issues that actually mean something to Canadians. So that's a win. It's a win for him. It's a win for the House of Commons. And quite frankly, it's a win for the government too. Because of all of a sudden, Justin Trudeau isn't facing daily questions or a barrage of questions, let's say, on a daily basis from Pierre Poilievre and Conservative MPs demanding that he personally apologize for what happened. So that's a win all around on three sides. But perhaps going back to Greg Fergus, the man, I think this is going to be something that is great for the House of Commons. Yes, this is one for the history books, the first person of color to be elected to the chair of speakers, to the Speaker's throne in Canada. That's going to go down in history. But we are talking about someone who holds the House of Commons in an extremely high reverence. This is a guy who subscribed to Hansard as a teenager, who literally received the debates of the House of Commons as a teenager, who was actively involved in the Liberal Youth Wing when he was a teenager. And he went to conventions, he went to everything. He served as a page in the House of Commons, something that actually selfishly I did as well back in 2010. So we're talking about someone who has literally lived and breathed a type of respect for the institution that is the House of Commons for the better part of his entire life, that I think it's going to bring kind of a breath of fresh air to the Speaker's chair. Do I think that immediately is going to lead to some type of revelation among partisans that they should all of a sudden actually behave in the House of Commons? No, absolutely not. And to be quite frank, question period is nothing more than political theater. The cameras are on is the only thing that people pay a moderate amount of attention to. It's where politicians can get their clips. So obviously, yes, they're going to continue to milk it for all it's worth from a partisan perspective. But I think Greg coming into the chair, kind of like he did the other day with the Prime Minister, demonstrating that like it doesn't matter what side of the House you're on, we're all going to hold the rules of this place in a bit higher standard, in a bit higher regard. We are going to hold this House in reverence in a way that it hadn't been done maybe for the last couple of years, as partisanship, as vitriol along all sides of the House kind of grew and amplified over the last couple of years. I think it's going to calm that down.
Lindsay, do you share John's optimism?
In some ways. So I think that any person that is appointed to be the next speaker would talk about the importance of respect and maintaining decorum. But I do think that John draws on an important point of Greg Fergus's background and who he is. And for that reason, I think that his remarks were genuine, and I think that he will give it his best shot. But I do agree with John in the sense that Question Period, we know, is a place for political theater and a place to score points and dunk on people opposite of the aisle. So yeah, I think he'll give it his best shot, but I think it's a hard task to keep party members in line when this is sort of the place where you're gonna practice political theater.
The other piece of history this week, Manitobans went to the poll and they elected a First Nations premier, Wab Kinew, leader of the NDP. John, we've got now NDP governments in Manitoba, BC, Rachel Notley, leader of the NDP in Alberta, pretty strong showing in the last election. Does that have any sort of play out, if you will, in terms of the federal scene, and also then impact whatever the federal NDP are demanding from the Liberal government in this coalition?
No, absolutely not. At the end of the day, this is going to be a nothing burger for the federal NDP. I hate to break it to Jagmeet Singh, but quite frankly, those premiers probably hold a lot more sway within NDP movements than he does. But at the end of the day, yes, we have a federated NDP in the sense that they are conjoined in some way between the provincial associations and the federal association. So yes, there is a level of overlap there that isn't necessarily seen across other political parties to this day. The Liberal Party used to be under such a structure. No longer anymore. However, there is a type of Western prairie populism that does exist in provincial NDP parties out there that simply isn't replicated by the federal NDP. And the federal NDP is, of course, trying to speak to voters in urban areas around Toronto, Halifax, Montreal, maybe Vancouver, where they are trying to pick up votes or where they do feel that they can maybe win some seats to gain back some relevance, let's say, in the House of Commons. Yes, they do have this fourth party agreement, let's say, with the governing Liberals on the supply and confidence agreement, but it ultimately doesn't sway any additional leverage into their sphere in the House of Commons. The Liberals will look at this and they'll see another potential partner on the provincial landscape, right? They'll see a premier who they might be more friendly with, someone who can partner with them to move things along with important policies like the Housing Accelerator Fund, for example, to build more affordable housing units in Winnipeg or to build more density in Winnipeg so that you do have that type of advancement of important policies that are going to be leading to the hopeful re-election of the Liberal government in their stance, right? But as far as Jagmeet Singh's influence as it relates to the uptake of Wab Kinew as premier in Manitoba, no, I would say that isn't affected. Certainly not in a positive way. If anything, he might just lose a bit of relevance on the national stage as more premiers actually come on board and are able to make decisions.
I want to look ahead to two things that we have going on next week. And Lindsay, I'll start with you on the first one, and that's the NDP Policy Convention, which happens the weekend after Canadian Thanksgiving. And that's happening in Hamilton. And I'm wondering, we see their policies, their priorities are universal pharmacare and affordability issues. Just wondering, do you, given your talks with people on the Hill, are you expecting anything different, or is that going to be at the forefront for the remainder of the year?
I would say that affordability issues, kitchen table issues are going to be dominating for sure. If you just look at Jagmeet Singh's social media messaging, and the things that he's focusing on, it's how do we make food cheaper? I'm going to go after grocer CEOs, and here's how we're going to do it. We saw that was particularly effective last session, so I'm sure that he'll continue to run with that. John brought up a good point about going after some of the voters in cities, and the polling we know in cities in terms of people's priorities are crime, poverty, and homelessness. So I think we'll see a lot of policy discussion around those issues, and I think affordability falls into those three categories. I wouldn't be surprised if there is a push just kind of building off of what's happened in Manitoba around healthcare and looking at how to increase staffing. I know that Wob Canoe, when he was talking to Vashi Capellos, just fresh off his victory, he talked about his team in Manitoba wanting to push for some sort of national strategy around hiring workers in healthcare. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some conversation around that makes it into the convention.
Speaking of healthcare, John, next week in your home province there in Prince Edward Island, health ministers across the country will gather. Any sense of what may be key on their agenda, picking up on what Lindsay was just saying in terms of increasing workforce?
Well, right off the bat, I might just point out the timing, right? This is coming at ultimately the kind of that capstone of where we're coming into flu season. And of course, last year, if we look back, we had kind of that perfect three-way storm of flu, RSV, and COVID that, especially for children's health, was a real difficulty across the health system in Canada. We saw children's hospitals, children's emergency rooms in particular, overflowing, nearing 150% capacity plus for sustained periods of time. So obviously, I would expect the fall wave of respiratory illnesses to be on the docket, especially with new COVID vaccines being approved for those 6 and above, and even children in the case of Pfizer, if I'm not mistaken. I saw a couple, Pfizer and Moderna had been approved recently. So I would anticipate to see something along those lines on the table. And of course, the provinces themselves are rolling out some activity these days, just awareness campaigns around, roll up your sleeve, get your vaccine. So of course, we'll see a little bit of that. But going back to what Lindsay was just talking about, the real focus here is going to be on the health workforce. The provinces, of course, got their big deal, let's say, from a federal perspective in the renegotiated Canada Health Transfer earlier this year. I would anticipate, as will always be the case from now until kingdom come, that the provinces will be coming with their hand out asking for more cash, and that in a press conference after the health ministers meeting, I'm sure they will voice their displeasure at not getting more cash if that comes to pass. But the real challenge that they're going to be fighting here seems to be the health workforce. They've all been commenting on it recently. And Federal Minister Mark Holland even commented on it recently, saying that he was looking forward to that discussion. So what I think we could see here could be policy mechanisms on the table, whether it is around, for example, the many Canadian students that travel abroad to get training in medical schools and that aren't able necessarily to come back and find those jobs and residencies in Canadian hospitals, or, for example, interprovincial migration of health workers. For example, earlier this year, we saw the Atlantic premiers roll out an Atlantic Accord around mobility of health workers through those 4 provinces. So I think we could see a little bit more traction here, because even going back to the Canada Health Transfer of earlier this year, this was one of the priorities identified by the federal government. And again, similar to an approach that they've used in many other policy forums, whether it is, for example, the Housing Accelerator Fund, where they're trying to use the incentive of federal cash to incentivize municipalities to do the right thing and change their zoning regulations. I think we could see a bit more activity around that type of regulatory action around incentives for the provinces to do more on labor mobility here.
Well, something we'll be all watching next week for sure. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you to my colleagues, Lindsay Campbell and John Dugal. I'm Janet Silver. Till next time.